The idea and thought of thankfulness is something that I feel that we don't spend enough time dwelling in that area. Sure, once in a while we have Thanksgiving, and we take that time to be intentionally thankful for all that we have. And I think sometimes the Lord is saddened by that because He does so much for us that sometimes we fail to recognize that. But we're going to dwell on that concept for a little bit today because this morning we're going to close our study in the book of Philippians, at least for a while. And the title of today's message is The Secret of Contentment. And we'll come back to that in just a moment, but I want to remind you or bring you up to speed in case you have not been here on the journey that we've had as we have gone through this book of Philippians. And the Lord has really done more with this than I had originally intended to when I started in on it. And we've had several weeks, several different messages, I understand, not in the full depth. I mean, it would take months and months to really hit this in all its entirety. But there's been so many rich truths that we find in this book of Philippians, this prison epistle, this letter that Paul writes to the church in Philippi as he is sitting in prison. And he's trying to get them to understand the theme of this book. He's trying to get them to understand joy. He's trying to get them to understand happiness. He's trying to get them to understand contentment in light of everything else that's going on around us. And I love the fact that this is a prison epistle because Paul throughout the book talks about this pursuit. This pursuit of joy, this pursuit of relationship with Jesus Christ. Why? Because He pursued us. And all of our ugliness and all of our nastiness and all of the shortcomings that we have, Jesus Christ leaves His throne. And He comes down here to pursue a relationship with you and with me and to pursue this relationship with all these countless others who have not yet decided to enter into that relationship. He made it possible for anybody and everybody to come into this relationship with Him. And as we opened this book, as we looked at the study, I asked the question, how are you doing? And what we talked about was, well, how we answer that question depends largely upon our circumstance. What's going on in life? And if we're living in a time of prosperity and our family is healthy and job is going well and boy, we're getting those promotions and I've got enough, I really don't have a whole lot of need for anything else. And we look at that and say, wow, life is good. And then the flip side of that is if you've just been diagnosed with cancer, the tendency would be to shift that attitude and say, well, you know what, life is kind of terrible. It's really, it's no good at all. I received some news about myself. I received news about a loved one, or I got a phone call and it said, you know what, your family's been in a terrible accident. And now we say, well, my joy is dependent upon that circumstance. And throughout this book, Paul has been trying to get us to understand, as he's sitting in prison writing this letter, that none of this depends on circumstance. In fact, we looked at this, and as we launched into this study, we were in Acts chapter 16. And how all this comes about because Paul couldn't do what he originally wanted to do, and the Holy Spirit said, nope, you're not going that way. You're going to where I need to send you. And he runs into this crowd as he is obedient to God. And we looked in Acts 16, and what we wanted you to understand through that is that this message Paul has, this is transcendent. This transcends time. This transcends circumstance. And whether you are a very rich CEO, when we looked at the life of Lydia, or very poor in the depths of prosperity and rejection, this poor little slave girl who was being used and abused because she was possessed by this demon that had the ability to foretell the future. And no matter where you are in that spectrum, Paul says, here's a message that applies to anybody and everybody. It doesn't matter what your background is, where you've been, where you're going. I've got something that you need to understand. And we've been on this journey, and I hope it's been a blessing for you in your life. And just this past week, somebody shared with me, he said, you know what, Pastor, I took you up on your challenge to stop reading academically, and I've just been working my way through just reading the book of Philippians, and wow, I'm starting to see things in everyday life, and that's encouraging. And I hope that this has been a study that's had you encouraged time and time again. But what we see is as this message began some 2,000 years ago, here comes this Saul of Tarsus who's on the Damascus road, and he has this conversion experience. And this Saul is the disciple or the apostle that we know became Paul, the person who wrote half of the New Testament. The person who had been plunged into the depths of every kind of adversity that you can possibly imagine. And for 2,000 years, he was kind of the initiator. He was the person who took this message with such force. He said, I've got something that you need to understand. And he was commissioned to go not only to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. And I want you to see something for just a moment that launched Paul's career, so to speak. In Acts chapter 9, and you don't have to turn there. In fact, I would encourage you to go to Philippians 14. That's where we'll be spending our time. Philippians 14. Philippians chapter 4. There's not 14 chapters in Philippians. But back here in Acts chapter 9, this was the beginning for Paul. Paul was on the Damascus Road, we come to know it as, on his way to get Christians, these followers of the way, so that he could arrest them and take them back, have them persecuted or put to death or whatever else. He had all the permissions to go. And on this road, he has this conversion experience. And he encounters the living Christ. And as a result of that experience, he surrenders his life to Christ. And we know that after that experience, he couldn't see. Right? For 3 days, his world was completely turned upside down. Not eating, not drinking, not being able to see. And right before this passage, all this is taking place. And here in Acts chapter 9, the Lord shows up to Ananias in a vision. And here in verse 15 he says, But the Lord said to Ananias, Go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and the people of Israel. And this vision is coming to Ananias. And Ananias said, Whoa, wait a minute, time out. I've heard of this Saul character. I just happen to know that he's got permission to come get people like me and make life very, very bad for me. And God shows up to Ananias and says, No, things have changed. And this is what I want you to do. Verse 16, I want you to show him how much he must what? Suffer for my name. Here is the launch of Paul's career as the greatest apostle, the greatest church planter, the greatest missionary that the planet has ever known. And it starts with the Lord showing up to Ananias when there's a group of people who wanted absolutely nothing to do with Saul because of how terribly he treated all the Christians. And he tells Ananias, I want you to go baptize them. When you show up, you put your hands, he's going to receive his sight back, and I want you to baptize him. And then he must understand how much he must suffer for my name. And so we see this idea at the beginning of all of this. Paul is baptized into a life of suffering for the sake of what? The furtherance of the gospel. And we look at this, and I would challenge us to think, how should our life be any different? How should our life, if we are truly going to go out and do what God has called us to do, why shouldn't we expect a life of suffering, a life of trial, and a life of tribulation? Now, I'm not saying that will happen, but somewhere along the lines, you're going to experience something. And I want you to get back to what the title of this message was, The Secret of Contentment, because this is how Paul started. And now Paul is writing to us, and he presents this concept in verse 11 that is very relevant to us today, and it's this concept of contentment. Contentment. And let me tell you why this is so important, because we live in a time where that idea, that word, is probably the most sought after idea or word in the entire, I was going to say English language, but I would say throughout the world, this idea of contentment has become so completely consuming. Because we all believe that we're desired to this idea of contentment. And it's probably the most sought after, most elusive concept in all the world, this idea of contentment, because we've got it wrong. Because we believe contentment comes by what we have, what we possess, how things are going. Am I healthy? Is all my relationships in good standing? I mean, this is how we evaluate the idea of contentment. And everything around us drives us to be more discontent every day. You know, it's amazing. If you look at TV, all the programming, everything you like, everything out there is designed to get you less content. It gets you thinking that your needs go beyond the common needs. And now your wants must become your needs. I mean, and you don't have to watch TV very long to know this. You have a particular program, you say, well, I silence all the commercials. I don't watch the commercials. It doesn't matter. All the programming revolves around this idea that you need to be less content than you really are and buy this product. In fact, all the programming that's out there, your favorite show, if it doesn't get the audience to be able to watch the commercials, what happens? It's gone. And so our entire society gets us to believe that we cannot be happy with what we have until we attain more. And we see this in every area of life, with this idea that things all around us are becoming bigger, faster, stronger. I mean, this is it. You look at, there's more to do than ever on this planet. There's more than ever, and yet we see a generation that seems to be bored outside their minds. You look at kids today, there's more than there's ever been, and kids seem to be so bored because this idea of contentment is growing. It's got to be bigger, it's got to be faster, it's got to be stronger. I've got just one example I'd like to show you that today, this idea of contentment. At that moment when we think we're content, something comes along to show us, well, we can no longer be happy with what we have. Some of you are going to recognize this, but I want you to listen to this for just a moment. Just one brief example. All right. Help me out. What was that? The old AOL dial-up internet, right? Back in the 90s when this thing came out, people were outside their minds excited. You'd go to your computer, you would initiate the dial-up process, and that would sometimes take so long you could go make yourself a little snack while you're waiting, right? And then you'd come back to your computer and you would be online unless your dad, your mom, or sibling somebody picked up the telephone and you'd yell at them, right? Get off the phone, I'm on the internet. Because it would mess up the connection when you did that. But in that moment, we would sit down and we would get on the World Wide Web. And I don't know about you, but I remember my first experiences with it. The first time I was able to chat with somebody, I thought, wow, that's absolutely incredible. The best I can figure, I was somewhere around 7th or 8th grade when we got dial-up internet. And as we waited for all the and all this, and we finally connect, I get on and I type some words, and I forget what platform it was. I typed some words and I sat there and waited. And then here comes a response. And the idea that that was somebody else, somewhere else in the world, just blew my mind. And I thought, this can't be true. This can't be right. It's got to be the computer responding because, I mean, look at, and although it takes 30 seconds to 5 minutes to connect to the internet, we'd get on there, boy, we were so happy with this new technology, this new work we had. Now, let me tell you, how many people are content now with that same dial-up connection? Nobody. Because we live in a society, that's just one example out of dozens and dozens and literally hundreds that I could show you. That says it's got to be stronger, it's got to be faster, it's got to be quicker, it's got to be so much better. And we see this ever growing, and now we find out we need things that we never even really wanted. Isn't that right? I mean, we never knew it was a want or a need until the world told us. Not only did I not want it, now I found out I need it. And so we spend more time. Contentment is a very highly prized yet very elusive virtue, and we spend more time working so we can make more money, so that we can earn more, so that we can go and we can acquire more. And some of you, and maybe not just you, but people all around, maybe we don't even work more, but we go out and we get more credit, so that we can have more of the things that we never even knew that we needed, so that we can be happy. And people, they search and they seek and so desperately want this contentment. And if we're not careful, what we do is we look for it in all the wrong areas. And we look to our job. And what we find out is that we never really make enough. Just a little bit more would always be a little bit better. Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. Or we look to relationships. And listen, this can be dangerous because relationships are very, very important. But if you seek out the relationship in and of itself as your source of contentment, somewhere along the lines you will be let down. A friend will betray you. A loved one will pass away. Something will inevitably happen in your life to where that relationship no longer provides the contentment that you thought it once did. And whether it's the workplace or money or power or relationship or any one of these other things, this is not where we need to be going to understand contentment. The idea of if I could just earn a little bit more, if I could just buy a little bit more, then I would be happy. Now, if you're keeping notes, what I want to do is give you your key thought, and that's simply this: contentment is learned, not earned. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we go through this, but contentment is learned, not earned. It does not matter how much money you make. Some of the most miserable people on this planet are the richest people on this planet. And it's not that you don't know that. Everybody has heard this by this point, and we all understand with more money comes more problems, comes more headaches, and takes more time. And we all understand very wealthy people can also be very bitter, very unhappy people. And so if you are seeking this idea of contentment, understand that it is not something that you earn. It's something that is learned. And here comes the Apostle Paul to tell you, listen, I have learned. I have learned. This man who is sitting in prison says, I have learned the secret of contentment, to which we stand back and say, okay, Paul, share it with me, would you? I wish I could be a little more content in life. And so we're going to focus just on these 3 simple verses here this morning. I say simple, yet so entirely profound that this can be life transforming if you understand it and you live it. So let's jump in, Philippians 4:11. Let's see what Paul has to say. 4:11, it says, I am not saying this because I am in need. Okay, this is talking about some giving that had just taken place. Verse 10, you go back and get the context of that a little bit later on. But here he is coming here in verse 11. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have what? Learned to be content. I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. So Paul, he's making a full circle. He started out saying, listen, circumstance does not depend on this life of joy, this life of contentment, this relationship, this pursuit of this life with God. He's saying, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstance. And as I have gone out of my way to point out, for so many of us, circumstance dictates how content we really are. And that's not true for just you. That's true for nearly every human. And if you're sitting here today and say, boy, I want it so desperate, but I struggle, something must be wrong with me. No, you're human. You're just like the rest of us. And this is why Paul comes along and says, this is something that I have learned. And if you're keeping notes, here's the idea. Contentment is learned, and then we say by hearing. And let me explain this to you just a little bit further. And the number one thing is simply this. If it has to be learned, then it's not natural. If this is a process that you must learn to do, then you got to understand it is not a natural part of life. And that word right there where it says learned, in the Greek, it means menthano. Menthano. Now, you don't care about that, and I understand that's okay, but understand the meaning of that word. It means literally to learn by hearing or being informed. That's going to become very important in the next verse. But menthano means to learn by hearing or being informed. It literally means to increase one's knowledge. And what you need to understand right here specifically, it's in regards to Scripture. Write that down because that gets very, very important here in just a little bit. But it's in regards to Scripture. Well, here comes Paul says, I have learned, it has been brought to my attention, I have been informed. How have you been informed, Paul? I've been informed through Scripture how to be content. Well, explain that, Paul. Well, Paul would have what we refer to nowadays as the Old Testament. Back then it was just the Scriptures. Right? We hadn't canonized all Paul's writings yet to know this has been from the Holy Spirit. And so Paul didn't even have his own work. He didn't have the work of Matthew or Mark or John or Luke. He didn't have all that. What he had was the Old Testament. And so I shared with you guys very briefly last week an illustration in Habakkuk. Remember that? And how Habakkuk was struggling so desperately because he's crying out to God, and God shows up and says, okay, I'm going to do this. And God does something he wasn't expecting. And he gets all worked up because he has now left what he knew to be true about God, and he focused on his problem, and it got him in a very desperate position until he reshifted his focus and got his attention back on God. And when he got his attention back on God, we get to the end of the chapter, or the end of the book of Habakkuk in chapter 3. And we see that Habakkuk, even though his circumstance has not changed, he is now worshiping and praising his God because now he understands God. He got himself back on that rock. He understood God is eternal. God is holy. God cannot make mistakes. God is faithful. All these things about God. And when you start dwelling on those concepts, I'm going to read to you again his response, and you don't have to turn there, but this is Habakkuk 3:17. It says, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold. And let me translate that for you again into today's words. Although I might lose my job, although my bank account's at zero, or maybe for some of you it's negative, right? It's below zero, it's lower than zero. Although the gas tank is on E, although there's no groceries in the cabinets at home, although all these things are going on, I don't understand why I'm in those circumstances. The next verse says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will joy in the God of my salvation. Wow. Oh, how do you get to that perspective? Well, let me show you Psalm 63:3. And here's David in the desert of Judah, fearful for his life. He says, because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. And here's David in the wilderness, afraid for his life. And rather than getting lost in circumstance and situation and things that are going on, although his life is being threatened and somebody wants him dead, he says, I can glory in my God because his love is better than my life. And so you see, these are the kinds of things that Paul would have had at his disposal. He would have had Habakkuk. He would have had the Psalms. He would have had all the writings from Solomon, all the writings from David, and all the writings from the most knowledgeable people on the planet that ever existed. The people who have entered into this relationship with their God and said, no matter what's going on, God is faithful. And he has this track record from Genesis all the way through Malachi of God's faithfulness. And he can look at that and say, regardless of what's going on in my life, I can understand I have a sovereign God. And if I have a sovereign God, then whatever's going on in my life has been allowed by him. And if it's been allowed by him, then I have this power and I have a purpose. And somehow, whether I am comfortable or not, this can be for God's glory. And in that, I can find purpose. And in that, I have learned how to be content. And so, Paul sees through these scriptures that no matter what, God is better than. God is better than those moments when I'm shipwrecked. God is better than the moments when I'm falsely accused. God is better than those moments when I'm being beaten. God is better than the thorn in my flesh. God is better. It doesn't matter if I have to lay my head on a chopping block, because God is better than anything else that's going on in my life. And so here's David. He says, I have learned how to be content. I have learned through the increase of knowledge, through reading the Holy Scriptures and understanding who my God is. I have learned how to be content. But you see, what's interesting is he says it twice. Look at verse 12. Verse 12 says, I know what it is to be in need. Now, we can all raise our hands with that, right? We all know what it is to be in need. We've all experienced that. And I know what it is to have plenty. And I would bet everybody in this room could raise their hands in that regard as well, if you take a moment to really think about it. He says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. Here he is again. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. He says, there's the secret. There's a secret. I have learned the secret of being content. Well, that's interesting. He said it twice. Paul says, how often does this thing work? When does it work? When things are good? No. In every situation, whether I'm well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And so here comes Paul. He says in verse 11, I have learned. I have mentano. I have learned by increase of knowledge the secret of being content. And then he comes back and says, he says again, I've learned. Well, thanks a lot, Paul. You've already said that. But this is where we lose a little bit in our translation. In this one, it's simply this. Contentment, if you're keeping notes, contentment is learned, okay? It's important you understand it. But this time, we got to understand, not only is it learned by increase of knowledge, but now we see that it is learned by practice. It is learned by practice. It's a different Greek word that is used right here. This is why I take the time to point this out, that you'll ever remember menthano. That's okay. But right here is the Greek word mueo. And it's a different word, which means to be initiated. And when you initiate something, that means to put into process, or to start a process or a practice, to initiate it, to begin something. And so here comes Paul. Don't miss this. I've learned through the Scriptures how to be content, and I have learned by putting those truths into practice. I've initiated them. I've taken these truths that I've learned, and I am putting them into work. And so now Paul says, all those things that I've heard, I am now learning to work out in my life. And he says, regardless of whether it's the good times or the bad times, I know what it is to have things comfortable and nice. Remember way back when I just alluded to it just a few moments ago in Acts chapter 16, as he's going to this place, he encounters Lydia. And as he encounters Lydia, we find out Lydia is a very wealthy, very well-to-do business lady. And this is not even her home, so she's probably here on a summer home kind of a process. And here comes Paul, somebody who's not used to having any kind of home. And remember what she said, come stay with me. And he stays with Lydia. And listen, when he's staying with Lydia, he probably has everything he could possibly want. Very wealthy woman, very appreciative of this relationship that Paul just introduced her to. And here's Paul in the home of Lydia, experiencing every finest element of life you can possibly. The best sleeping arrangements, the best food, the best accommodation, the best of everything. And here's Paul. And on the same token, the next day he can get up and he can walk away and continue on with what God has called him to do. And you know what happens to him the next day. As he goes on, he encounters this little slave girl, and this little slave girl is demon-possessed. And he casts the demon out of that little girl, and the townspeople didn't like that very much. And so one night, he's in the fashionista CEO's awesome pad, is the way they'd say it nowadays. This fantastic home. And where's he the next night? In a jail cell for doing what God has called him to do. I've experienced the finest things in life. I've experienced the lowest things in life. And he's sitting in that jail cell. What's he doing right about midnight? He's singing. He's praising God. Not, oh, I wish I would have stayed with Lydia. Things were so much more comfortable over there. Oh, no. He's praising God, and so he's saying, regardless of what's going on in my life, every situation, well-fed or hungry, living in plenty, or in the mansion or in the jail cell, I have learned the secret of being content by what Scriptures tell me, and then by putting those things into practice. And we see the tensions that's there. Right? Because after we experience the nicer things in life, we don't feel like we can go backwards and experience anything less. Listen to me, that's a big problem in today's generation. Kids nowadays, now your generation is very different. You grew up, you worked hard for where you are. Your first house maybe cost $2,000, right? 20 grand, I don't know. I think my parents told me their first house cost $20,000. And that's when we were very young kids. And then the standard of living started to rise as they made more money. They bought nicer, and they earned themselves to a more comfortable situation in living. And they worked hard for what they had. But you know, we live in this age that says, I can't be content. Once I've experienced the nicer, I don't feel like I can go and I can regress, or I can go back to something that wasn't as nice. And so nowadays, we've got kids who leave the home, and what do they got to have? They got to have at least as nice as, if not better than, Mom and Dad had. I can't go backwards. No, our culture, our society doesn't tell us that that's an okay thing to do. And so they mortgage themselves to the hilt, and they borrow and credit, and then ultimately they get themselves in trouble. Why? Because as Christians, we follow the law of the harvest. We reap what we sow, and we sow a little bit of trouble now. We reap greater later because we don't feel like we can go backwards. And here's Paul saying, whether I'm here or I go backwards, there's this way that I've learned to be content in absolutely everything. Yeah, I'm currently doing some premarital counseling. And in the counseling is this concept, and I've learned this outside, but it's reminded me because of this counseling. One of the lessons that you have to learn to ask the question, have you learned the habit of happiness? Have you learned the habit of happiness? And doctors Les and Leslie Parrott say this is maybe one of the most important foundational things in a marriage. Regardless of what's going on in life, have you developed a habit of happiness? And in other words, what he's saying, what they're saying is, this is a choice that you make. Regardless of what's going on, can you choose to be happy regardless of whatever else is going on around you? And as couples, that's very, very important. I would say as Christians, that's even more important. Because listen to me, we get lost in so many of our first world problems, don't we? We have so much more than we've ever had. And we're so less content than we used to be. And this habit of happiness is that thing that says, okay, it's a terrible day because I was on my way to work today and my car broke down. Listen to me, you got a car. You had a car in which it was allowed to break down. You have any idea how many people on this planet would love to have a car? All these people on bikes, and you can follow this to its logical end, and the person's on a bike, and the bike gets a flat tire, and that person goes and complains about his flat tire, and there's somebody else who doesn't even have a bike, says, oh, I wish I just had a bike. I got to walk everywhere. And they go around and complain, and they're in the hospital room and say, oh, you're lucky you get to walk because I'm confined to a bed, paralyzed from the neck down. Life is terrible. And somebody else is in the same hospital dying of cancer, got a couple days left, but at least you get to live. You see the process, everything about developing the habit of happiness. You can find something positive in everything if you choose to do so. And this is what Paul's saying. You've got to put it into practice because we already know the truths. We already know it's there. But we don't do it because it's hard to do. It's easier to sign on the line. It's easier to sign on the line and to obtain those things that we believe will give us standing with people around us and the things that will make us content. Just to find out that it's just an empty. Now listen to me. I'm not saying there's problems with things. Okay, don't think that's what. But when you are looking to those things and those possessions and that money as your source of happiness, they will let you down every time. Paul says it's so much deeper than all of that. And so here's Paul saying circumstances don't matter. My happiness does not depend on what's going on in my life. He's saying my joy comes from something so much deeper. Whether it's prosperity or it's poverty, it comes so much deeper. And here we come. This is probably the most famous verse in all the book of Philippians. I would say this is probably very close to John 3:16 in today's world. And here it is. It says, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Now, you got to be careful with this verse. Listen to me. You've got to be very careful with this verse. First off, most people don't say it this way. I can do all this through him. What do they say? I can do all things through him who gives me strength. And we throw this verse out there in any and every circumstance, expecting it to magically give us what we need to have. And we got to understand this morning that this verse is not unlimited power to do whatever you want to do. Listen, there's some things you were not intended to do. I cannot jump over my house. I can't do it. And I can sit here and recite this verse all day long, and it's not the intent. I'm not an NBA basketball player. I cannot pray this verse a few times, show up to the Detroit Pistons team and say, here I am. I can do this because God is going to give me the strength to do this. There's some things we weren't meant to do. You heard Nancy playing the piano this morning. I could try. Let me pray first. And the prayer is going to be that y'all don't get up and leave. There's some things I was not intended to do. And in those moments, I am not instructed to recite this verse and expect now I have unlimited power and unlimited resource to do whatever it is that I want to do. Some people look at this and they use it as their basis for miracles and healings. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Well, if that's possible, I'll be right next to my sister's bed in the hospital in Arizona. God, give me the strength. Give me the strength. Give me the strength. God, you can do this. I can do all things. I can heal through Christ who gives me strength. I can do it all. And we've got to understand something. Now, don't get me wrong. God still does miracles in His way and in His time. And sometimes our faith plays an element in that, and sometimes it's just flat out His sovereign will. Because let me tell you, my faith is stronger than it's ever been, but I'm still good regardless of what God decides to do with my sister. Does she get up and walk tomorrow? Fantastic. God is great. To Him be the glory. Does she not get up and do it? And by the way, I got a call from her yesterday. We Skyped. That was so cool. And she's talking, and she sounded like herself. Praise God. I mean, she's not all the way healed, but we're going to celebrate the little things, and we're going to develop the habit of happiness. And we're going to understand, we're going to be happy over this little thing that she can do rather than get lost and troubled over all the things that she has not yet been able to accomplish. I'm getting off track. Let's get back to this. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. You've got to pay attention to these words. I can do all this. And understand what Paul said, okay? All this is the things that God is asking him to do. I can do all this. And it's talking about this inward strength. And this leads us to the next principle I want you to understand. Contentment comes from what's inside, not what's outside. Contentment comes from what's inside, not what's outside. Listen, we all get wrapped up on what's on the outside. And that's when we get the most discouraged that we ever get. But what we got to understand is through this relationship with Jesus Christ comes this tremendous source of power that you can't see. But listen, that's the most important part. Right? We see this all the time, too. I mean, nature reveals this everywhere. You realize the most important part of the tree is the part that you can't see. Right? It's the root system. It's that part that's underground, the structure that gives it its strength to stand in all the winds. It gives it its nutrients to continue to grow and become strong and powerful. And when the storm does come, it's grounded, firmly grounded, and it's healthy. And you can't see that part, but it's the most important part. And the same is true in the believer's life. What you can't see, your foundation, is the most important part of all of this. Because it's what's on the inside. And then when the storms come from the outside, and you're standing on that rock that Habakkuk found himself on, you've got a firm stand now. And through this relationship with Christ, through the strength that He gives you, you now have what you need to withstand whatever it is that comes your way. I like this translation just a little bit better. And I don't mean this to be a discouragement if this is your favorite verse, but I love the way the Living Bible says it. It says, I can do everything God asks me to with the help of Christ who gives me the strength and power. Not I can do all things. And use that as a blanket verse to do whatever it is we want to do. You got to understand the context. What was Paul just writing about? Paul is talking about the good times. Paul is talking about the bad times. Pull into context now. I can do all of this. Whether it's good times, whether it's bad times, all these things that God had asked me to do. I wanted to go witness over here. God said, nope, you're going this way. Okay, I can do that. Why? I can do it through the strength and power that Christ has given me. That source, that power that you cannot see. Yeah, but Paul, you're going to be shipwrecked. It doesn't matter. Paul, you're going to be beaten. It doesn't matter. Because God is sovereign. And if I am pursuing a relationship with Him, then I am walking step in step with Him. And He is by my side the whole way. And He will never lead me to a place where He cannot protect me. He'll never lead you to a place where He can't take care of you. Regardless, and this is where Paul says, it's not what's on the outside that matters. It's what's in here. And the theme of this book has been Paul's relentless pursuit of this relationship with Jesus Christ. That says, through this relationship, I can now do all things. Whatever it is that God asks me to do. He's going to ask you to go through that tough time with the cancer, with the loved one. It doesn't matter. I can do it. I can do it. Why? Because He has given me the strength to do it. And so, wrapping it up this morning, I want you to understand that you can find contentment in fill in the blank. What is going on in your life right now? Whatever it is. And as I look out, I know that I see a room that represents many, many, many different needs. Some of you are doing pretty well off. Some of you, you're hardly scraping by. But regardless of where you are this morning, you can find contentment through the power and strength that Christ has given you, through your relationship with Him. And you see what this letter reveals is that Paul was never the victim of his circumstance. Throughout the letter, we see that Paul is always the victor over circumstance. Never do we see the woe is me. That's incredible. Because there's not too many people in this room that can raise their hand and say, I've experienced the things that Paul's experienced. And if you think you're close, think of the next logical one. The next one's your head on the chopping block. And still have that positive attitude. This is the Apostle Paul, the one who started with Ananias. And God did not hide it from him from the very start. Paul, from this point on, you're going to have a life of difficulty. You need to understand how much you will suffer for my name's sake. You're going to be a witness of all of my goodness, all my love. You're going to go to the Gentiles. You're going to go to the Jews. You're going to go all over the place. And you're going to experience every kind of thing in between. But you can do it because I'm going to give you the strength that you need to do it. And I just want to wrap up with that key thought one more time. Contentment is learned, not earned. How do we learn it? Through the knowledge of what the Scriptures tell us. Through hearing it, through reading it, through being informed. And then we learn, Paul says, the second way, mueo, by initiating the process. Get it started. Put into practice. We talked about this last week, didn't we? Putting into practice. Your practice ought to match your position. Regardless of, and we understand this is betrayal, but if you're a Christian this morning, the practice, the things that you do ought to match your position in Christ. And you realize when it doesn't, that's when the Christians get the label of hypocrite. That's when we become so unlovely to the people all around us. And you can make as much money as you want, buy as many things as you want. And Paul is saying that is not how you obtain contentment. One of the greatest Christians ever walked this planet has just told us, I've learned a secret. Now this morning, if it's our desire to be content, are we willing to listen to what he has told us? And we understand this morning it's because of his pursuit in his relationship with Jesus Christ. Now you might be here this morning and say, well, you know what, I believe all this, but I've got the end of myself and I got the end of circumstance, and I still don't feel like I've got it. I still can't be content. I still feel bad. Hey, listen, if you've been living in a life of sin, this is not a get out of jail free card. If you've been living a life of sin, you've been doing that sin thing, and you know it's wrong, you keep going. There's also a biblical concept that says, okay, well, sometimes you're going to be chastised. Sometimes you're going to be punished for the sin that you commit. But if you shift your thinking and turn away from all the ugly, the promise says, I'm going to give you the strength to get you from where you are to where I want you to be. And it's through pursuing this relationship with Jesus. Stand with me if you would. On your note sheet right there, under application, it says, today I will learn to be content with whatever it is. I want you to fill that blank in this morning. Because regardless of where you are in your relationship with Jesus, there's something going on in your life that maybe you are not satisfied with, that you are not content with. And somewhere along this process, either you need to learn the truth behind it or you need to put into practice the truth you already know. But you so desperately want to be content. You're tired of beating your brains out, pulling your hair out, trying to pursue all the things that the world tells us is necessary in order to be content. In a moment, Roger's going to come lead us in a song that says, God is so good. And my hope, my prayer this morning is that you can sing these words this morning and believe them from the depths of your heart, regardless of anything else that's going on. And if you can't, whatever it is, as you sing that song, God is so good, you think of one spot in your life where you say, well, not so much there. Maybe that needs to be your blank this morning. Regardless of what's going on, I can learn to be content with this by putting into practice what I already know. And if you need to come up and pray while we sing, I invite you to do so. I'd be happy to pray with you. But my encouragement is simply be obedient as the Spirit leads this morning. Roger, would you come please lead us? Father in heaven, this morning we recognize that you are so good. Father, regardless of the circumstances that we are experiencing in life, Father, I pray that we can all this morning say, I praise your name, regardless of whatever it is we're struggling with. Father, give us the strength to put our faith into action. Father, to believe with all of our hearts what your word has to tell us. Father, I pray that each individual in this room this morning will be encouraged because they serve a God who is in control of everything that life has to throw at us. Thank you for those wonderful promises. Go with us now as we part ways. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.